The morning had started the way I loved it. Soft sunlight through the blinds, the smell of coffee drifting through the kitchen, the quiet hum of sprinklers watering the front yard. For once, it felt like peace. But peace, in this neighborhood, never lasted long. I stepped outside with my mug, barefoot on the dewy grass, when I froze. Two men stood right in the middle of my yard, clipboards in hand, muttering to each other like they were inspecting a construction site. One of them actually had his boot planted on my flower bed, crushing the tulips I'd spent all weekend planting. "Excuse me," I shouted. They didn't even flinch. I took 2 steps closer, heart pounding. "Hey, get off my property." My voice cracked through the morning air like a whip. The man with the gray polo looked up lazily, squinting as if I'd interrupted something important. "Ma'am," he said in a tone soaked with arrogance, "we're just conducting a compliance inspection. Routine HOA business." "Routine," I snapped. "You're standing in my backyard. You didn't knock. You didn't ask permission. This is private property." The other man, younger, glanced at his clipboard and smirked. "We're allowed to enter common areas," he muttered. "Common areas?" I stepped forward until we were practically toe-to-toe. "This is my lawn, not yours." For a moment, none of them spoke. I could hear the distant buzz of a lawn mower from down the street, the faint whistle of wind brushing against the fence. My hands were trembling, but not from fear, from the pure insult of being treated like I didn't matter. The older man, the one in charge, finally sighed and said, "Look, ma'am, if you have a problem, you can take it up with the board. We have authority here." Authority. That word burned like acid. They turned their backs to me and started scribbling on their clipboards again, pointing at my fence, at the shed, at my trees like they were property assessors on government land. I stood there, gripping my coffee mug so tight I thought it might shatter. When they finally walked away, one of them actually waved at me, mocking, dismissive. "Have a good day, ma'am," he said without looking back. The gate clanged shut behind them, leaving muddy footprints across my grass and crushed petals beneath their boots. Inside, my hands shook as I dialed the HOA office. No one answered. Of course they didn't. They never did when homeowners called about their behavior. I sat at the kitchen table staring out the window at the mess they'd left, and for the first time, I realized how wrong this felt. See, most homeowners think HOAs have unlimited power, but that's not true. They can't enter private property without written notice or permission, not even for inspections. It's called trespassing. At that moment, though, I wasn't thinking about laws. I was thinking about the look on that man's face, the way he enjoyed making me feel small. As the day wore on, anger slowly replaced shock. I called a few neighbors, asked if anyone else had unannounced visits. Some had, but none wanted to talk about it. "Don't stir things up, Sarah," one whispered. "You'll only make it worse." By sunset, I'd almost convinced myself to let it go. Maybe they wouldn't come back. Maybe this was over. I washed my hands, poured another cup of coffee, and tried to focus on the soft hum of the crickets outside. But then, just as the clock hit midnight, I heard it. A faint crunch of gravel. Slow, deliberate footsteps outside my window. I froze. Someone was out there again. And that's when I realized the HOA wasn't done with me yet. The next morning, the sound of knocking wasn't what woke me. It was the command that followed. A deep, assertive voice barked through the front door. "Open the gate, ma'am. We have authority here." I froze, mug in hand, every muscle in my body tightening. When I stepped outside, Mark Daniels was already standing at the end of my walkway, hands on his hips like a drill sergeant inspecting his troops. 2 other board members hovered behind him, their clipboards clutched like weapons. Mark didn't smile. He didn't even say good morning. "Good morning, Mr. Daniels," I managed through clenched teeth. "Do you mind explaining why you're yelling at me on my own porch?" He took a slow step forward, the kind of move people make when they know they hold the upper hand. "We received reports of restricted access behind your property," he said, his voice cool and rehearsed. "You've placed obstacles that prevent community inspection of the rear fencing. That's a violation." I blinked. Restricted access? That's my backyard. You don't have any right to be back there. Mark adjusted his sunglasses, giving me a half smirk. Actually, ma'am, under our bylaws, the HOA has community-wide access to all yards for maintenance and inspection. It's standard procedure. I took a breath, trying to keep my voice steady. Show me the bylaw that says you can walk into someone's backyard without permission. He didn't flinch. We don't need to show you anything right now. Just open the gate. There it was. The arrogance, the entitlement, the quiet threat behind every word. I could almost feel my pulse in my ears. No, I said flatly. You're not stepping foot back there. His tone hardened. Refusal to comply can lead to disciplinary action. You agreed to community oversight when you moved here. No, I shot back, my voice rising. I agreed to pay dues and follow rules that make sense. I didn't agree to be invaded. The men behind him exchanged awkward glances. Mark's expression darkened. You're making this more difficult than it needs to be, Mrs. Thompson. If you just cooperate, this will be easier for everyone. He used my last name like a weapon, sharp and condescending. That moment told me everything I needed to know about him. This wasn't about community standards. It was about control. I crossed my arms. Unless you've got a warrant or a deeded easement, you're not coming in. And you can tell your board that I'll be looking into this. For a second, the corner of his mouth twitched. Anger, disbelief, maybe even amusement. You can look all you want, he said, stepping back toward the sidewalk. But remember, ma'am, we have authority here. I stood there watching as he walked away, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel, every stride dripping with superiority. The other board members followed him, whispering quietly. One of them glanced back at me, almost apologetically, before they disappeared around the corner. I stayed outside for a long time, my heart hammering. The word authority echoed in my head, bitter and wrong. I knew enough about property rights to recognize the lie. No HOA, not even one with an inflated sense of power, can claim access to private property without a written, recorded easement in the county records. And Mark Daniels sure as hell didn't have that. Still, the way he spoke, the certainty in his tone, it planted a seed of unease. If he could walk up to my door and demand entry today, what would stop him from crossing that line again tomorrow? By evening, I thought maybe I'd imagined the threat in his voice, until I opened my front door to grab the mail. There, pinned to the wood with a thumbtack, was a crisp white paper fluttering in the wind, big bold letters across the top. Comply or face immediate penalties. The HOA had just declared war. The letter wasn't a notice, it was a threat. Thick red ink bled across the top like a wound. Final warning, non-compliance. My hands trembled as I unfolded it, the paper stiff and expensive, like they wanted to make sure their intimidation felt official. The HOA seal sat in the corner, stamped and smug, just like Mark Daniels' voice echoing in my head. We have authority here. My eyes darted over the list of so-called violations. Obstruction of community access, unauthorized landscaping, failure to comply with inspection requests. I actually laughed under my breath at first. Unauthorized landscaping? They were referring to my backyard garden, my roses and lilacs that I'd planted 3 years ago, long before Mark was even elected HOA president. But the laughter didn't last long. The more I read, the clearer it became. This wasn't about rules. It was about punishment. The letter wasn't asking me to fix anything. It was daring me to resist. The tone dripped with arrogance. Failure to correct these issues will result in daily fines and potential legal escalation. I could almost hear Mark dictating it, savoring every word. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the page, the morning light cutting sharp across the wood. For the first time, fear crept in, not just for my property, but for what kind of power these people thought they had. If they could accuse me of made-up violations today, what would stop them from issuing liens or dragging me to court tomorrow? Then something inside me hardened. Fear shifted into anger. Hot, clean, and precise. I'd spent my whole life following rules, paying dues, mowing my lawn exactly to code. And now some power-drunk committee thought they could bully me out of my own yard? No, not this time. I grabbed my phone and started researching. Within minutes, I learned something every homeowner should know. An HOA cannot fine you without a hearing. It's a violation of due process, plain and simple. They have to notify you in writing, give you a date, and allow you to speak before any penalty is imposed. And this final warning was missing all of that. No date, no hearing, no right to respond. That's when I decided to start documenting everything. Every time someone from the HOA came near my property, every conversation, every letter, every footprint, I'd record it. I pulled out an old notebook from the drawer, wrote the date across the top, and began. March 14th, 9:42 a.m. Received HOA warning letter. No prior notice. No hearing scheduled. Mark Daniels previously appeared on property uninvited. Next, I snapped photos of the crushed flower bed, the muddy footprints still pressed into the soil from their inspection. I even recorded a video walking along my fence line, narrating what had happened. I wasn't just defending my property anymore. I was building a case. But the thing about paranoia, it doesn't need much to grow. Every sound that night felt louder. The creak of the house, the whisper of the wind against the windows, even the hum of the refrigerator, all of it made my chest tighten. Around midnight, I finally convinced myself to go to bed. Still, something felt off. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was the way the neighborhood had gone eerily silent. Either way, I rolled over and glanced at the small monitor on my nightstand, the one connected to the new security camera I'd installed that morning. And there it was, a figure, tall, hooded, moving slowly through my gate. The motion light flared to life, but whoever it was didn't run. They stood there for a moment, staring toward the house, before disappearing into the shadows. My breath caught. Someone was back in my yard, and this time, they weren't hiding who they were. The floodlight snapped on, and I screamed. Two figures were crouched near my shed, their flashlights slicing through the dark like knives. For a split second, all I could hear was the pounding in my chest and the soft crunch of grass under their boots. My voice cracked the night air. "Who's there?" The figures froze. Then one of them whispered something I couldn't make out, and they bolted. I stumbled backward into the kitchen, heart hammering, fumbling for my phone. My fingers shook so badly I nearly dropped it twice before dialing 911. "Someone's in my backyard," I gasped, voice barely holding steady. "They're trespassing. Please just send someone." The dispatcher's calm tone felt almost insulting. "Stay inside, ma'am. Officers are on their way." I stood by the back door clutching a kitchen knife I didn't remember grabbing, watching the yard bathed in harsh white light. My shed door was ajar. I could see it swinging slightly, creaking with each gust of wind. I tried to focus on small details just to keep from panicking: the smell of damp soil, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog, the faint metallic click as the security light timer reset. Every second felt like an hour. By the time the police arrived, the yard was empty. They swept the property with flashlights, looked around half-heartedly, and shrugged. "Probably neighborhood kids," one of them said, shining his light across the trampled grass. "Kids," I repeated, incredulous. "Kids don't carry clipboards or hide behind sheds." He gave a small, tired sigh, scribbled something on a notepad, and said, "Well, no harm done, right? Just keep your lights on. Maybe get better locks." I stared at him. No harm done? Someone had entered my property. Again. Days after the HOA president warned me to comply. It wasn't random. I knew it in my gut. But the officers left without even taking a report. Their car rolled away, and the silence that followed was heavier than before. I double-checked every window, locked every door, and sat awake until dawn. The adrenaline had burned off, leaving behind something colder. The realization that I was completely alone in this fight. The HOA had power, connections, and intimidation tactics. All I had was a camera, a notebook, and a growing sense that I was being watched. Around 3 in the morning, I pulled up the security footage again. There it was, clear as day. Two figures walking side by side, not teenagers but grown men. One of them even turned toward the camera for a moment. The frame froze, catching the faint gleam of a badge clipped to his belt. My breath hitched. That wasn't random. That was official. I remembered something my neighbor once told me when I first moved in, that the HOA sometimes partnered with local maintenance contractors to check yards. But this wasn't maintenance. This was trespassing. Under Texas law, uninvited entry onto private property is trespassing, HOA or not. They had crossed a line, and I knew now it wouldn't stop unless I pushed back. But beneath the anger, a darker emotion was brewing. The kind that comes from knowing someone's willing to break the law just to make you bend. It wasn't about grass height or fences anymore. This was personal. When morning light finally crept through the blinds, I tried to convince myself that it was over. Maybe they'd gotten what they wanted. Maybe it was just a scare tactic. I walked to the front door, exhausted, rubbing my temples, and then I saw it. A small folded note slid under the door, the paper slightly damp from dew. I picked it up with trembling fingers. 4 words were written in bold black marker, each letter pressed hard into the paper. "Stop resisting, Sarah." My stomach turned to ice. Whoever they weren't done, and I had just become their target. The sun hadn't even climbed past the rooftops when I saw him, Mr. Wilson, my next-door neighbor, sitting on his porch in that same old rocking chair he'd had since I moved here. His coffee mug was steaming, a newspaper folded on his lap. He looked up as I walked by, the exhaustion in my eyes apparently louder than any words I could have said. "You look like you haven't slept," he said softly, motioning for me to sit. I hesitated. I'd never really talked to him beyond the occasional hello. But something in his voice, calm, low, almost fatherly, made me pause. I sat down on the porch step, clutching my coffee like a lifeline. "They were in my yard again," I said finally. "2 of them. Middle of the night." He sighed, long and deep, like a man carrying more stories than he wanted to tell. "You're not the first, Sarah." The way he said it made my stomach twist. "What do you mean?" He looked out across the street, his eyes unfocused. "Mark's been doing this for years. Ever since he took over the HOA. Start small, a warning, a fine, a letter. Then the inspections. Before long, people start packing up, selling, moving out." I shook my head, stunned. "He scares people out?" "Scares, manipulates, sometimes threatens. He uses the bylaws like weapons," Mr. Wilson said. "He'll tell you your fence violates Section 4, Article 9, or that your mailbox is half an inch too tall. It's nonsense, but most folks don't have the time or energy to fight it. So they just leave." He rubbed his thumb against the rim of his mug, staring at the ripples in his coffee. "You know the Jenkins family? The ones who lived on the corner lot? He fined them nearly $5,000 for unauthorized exterior modifications. All they did was repaint their door. That's—" I stopped myself. There wasn't a word sharp enough. "How does he get away with that?" Mr. Wilson chuckled bitterly. "Because no one fights him. Everyone's scared. The board's full of his friends. And the few who do push back." He trailed off, eyes narrowing. "Well, they don't last long." A chill crawled up my spine. "You're saying he targets them?" "I'm saying," he said slowly, "that Mark Daniels doesn't like losing control. And when someone challenges him, things happen. Cars get towed, lawns get reported, liens appear out of nowhere. You think you're dealing with one man, but you're really up against a system that protects itself." I sat in silence, the distant hum of traffic the only sound between us. Every word he said painted a clearer picture of what I was up against. A machine disguised as a neighborhood committee. But beneath my fear, something stronger was building. Anger. A deep, righteous anger that tasted like iron in my mouth. "He picked the wrong woman," I said quietly, more to myself than to him. Mr. Wilson gave me a sad smile. "Good. You'll need that fire. But be careful. Don't let him know what you're planning." I nodded, my mind already racing with what I could do. There has to be a way to hold him accountable. HOA records, financials, meetings, something. There is, he said, leaning forward. By law, homeowners can demand access to HOA records, financial reports, meeting minutes, violation logs, all of it. But you'll have to ask in writing, and when you do, he'll know you're digging. I felt my pulse quicken. That was it, a foothold, a way to fight back. I stood, determination replacing the exhaustion. Thank you, Mr. Wilson. I'm done being scared. But before I could step off the porch, his hand closed gently around my wrist. His eyes, old, weary, and full of something that looked a lot like warning, met mine. One woman tried that once, he said quietly. She fought back. She even had proof of what Mark was doing. I swallowed hard. What happened to her? He looked down at his coffee, then back at me. She disappeared from this street, Sarah. And no one ever saw her again. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the HOA office. My pulse was pounding so hard it felt like thunder in my ears. I clutched the warning letter in my hand, edges crumpled from the dozen times I'd read it. The conference room smelled faintly of stale coffee and cheap air freshener. A perfect mix for the people who thought they ran this neighborhood like a military camp. Mark Daniels sat at the head of the table, as if he were presiding over a courtroom instead of a volunteer committee. His tie was too tight, his smile too polished. 5 board members sat beside him, flipping through stacks of papers they probably didn't even understand. I didn't wait to be acknowledged. I slammed the letter on the table so hard that the papers in front of them fluttered. You want to fine me? Say it to my face, Mark. The room went dead quiet. One of the board members, a timid woman I recognized from down the E Street, looked down at her lap. Another pretended to check his phone. No one met my eyes. Mark leaned back in his chair, folding his hands across his chest, clearly enjoying the spectacle. Mrs. Thompson, he began smoothly, there's no need to raise your voice. We're simply enforcing community standards. Nothing personal. Nothing personal? I snapped. You sent men into my backyard without notice, accused me of violations that don't exist, and left threats on my door. That's not enforcement. That's harassment. He tilted his head, a condescending smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. We've received multiple reports about your property. As board president, it's my duty to ensure compliance. If you're feeling singled out, perhaps that's your perception, not reality. My perception. The way he said it made me want to throw something. You're lying, I said. And you know it. You can't fine anyone without a hearing, and I haven't been offered one. You're violating HOA law. He chuckled, shaking his head as if he were dealing with a child. Sarah, we're not a courtroom. We don't operate on internet legal advice. That got a few nervous laughs from the board. Small, unsure, the kind of laughter people use when they're afraid to do anything else. Then maybe you should start. I shot back. Because HOA meetings like this are required to be open to homeowners. They're supposed to be recorded. You can't just make up rules because you like the sound of your own voice. The room went still again. Mark's jaw tightened just slightly, enough to tell me I'd hit a nerve. Mrs. Thompson, he said, his tone suddenly colder. I'd advise you to choose your words carefully. Disrespecting the board isn't going to help your case. My case? I said, laughing bitterly. You mean the one you invented? He ignored that. If you have concerns, you may submit them in writing. Otherwise, this meeting is over. No, I said, stepping closer to the table. It's not over until you tell me why you keep coming after me. For the first time, his mask slipped. The smugness faltered, just for a second, replaced by something darker. Because rules are rules, he said quietly. And no one is above them. He stood abruptly, gathering his papers, signaling that the discussion was finished. I felt every eye in the room shift to me. Pity from some, fear from others, but not 1 ounce of support. Fine, I thought. I didn't need their approval. I just needed the truth. As I turned to leave, something on the far end of the table caught my attention. A black binder sat open near Mark's chair, filled with printed sheets, names, addresses, and notes scrawled in red pen. I glanced down just long enough to see my own name. It was circled. Next to it, in thick handwriting, were two words that made my blood run cold. Problem owner. And for the first time, I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a hit list. The county office smelled like old paper and dust. The kind of place where time moved slower and truth was buried under layers of bureaucracy. I stood at the counter, clutching my folder of HOA letters and violation notices, trying not to let my frustration show. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with glasses perched low on her nose, flipped through my documents with a faint frown. Her nails clicked against the counter as she read the line that had haunted me for weeks. HOA access easement, rear boundary. After a moment, she sighed, turned toward the back shelves, and disappeared into the archives. The minutes stretched like hours. I could hear the faint hum of a printer somewhere behind me and the echo of footsteps down the tiled hallway. When she finally returned, she set a thin, dusty folder on the counter and slid it toward me. "Here you go, ma'am," she said, brushing the dust from the cover. "Property record for 419 Crescent Lane." I opened it, scanning quickly for the line that should confirm the HOA's claim. An easement, a shared access path, something. But the page was clean. No easement, no shared boundary rights. Nothing but a single line marking the fence as private property. I looked up, my voice barely steady. "Are you sure this is everything?" She nodded. "It's all there. There's no easement on your property." They lied. Her words hit like a hammer to the chest. For weeks, Mark Daniels and his board had claimed authority based on that one phrase, community access. They'd used it to barge into my yard, find me, humiliate me, and it was all fiction, a fabrication. I felt something inside me shift. The confusion, the anxiety, the late nights replaying security footage. It all started to melt into something sharper. Vindication. Cold, clean, undeniable. I left the office clutching those papers like a weapon. The Texas sun hit my face as I stepped outside, and for the first time in weeks, the light didn't feel harsh. It felt righteous. Every step to my car was measured, deliberate. They had crossed every line imaginable, and now I had proof. I sat behind the wheel for a long moment, staring at the folder in my lap. "They lied to all of us," I whispered, and it was true. Not just to me, but to every family who had been bullied into silence, fined without reason, and driven out of their homes by a man who thought power made him untouchable. On the way home, I drove through the neighborhood with new eyes. The identical mailboxes, the manicured lawns, the polite smiles from neighbors who barely spoke. It all looked different now. It wasn't a community. It was a controlled zone, ruled by intimidation and paperwork. And Mark had been its dictator for far too long. The law was clear. Property easements are public record. Any access rights or shared maintenance agreements must be filed with the county. If it's not there, it doesn't exist. Every homeowner has the right to check those records before complying with any HOA order, but no one ever did, because no one thought they could. That was about to change. By the time I got home, my fear had burned away completely. The air felt sharper, the noise of the cicadas louder, the world suddenly alive with purpose. I spread the documents across my kitchen table, taking pictures, highlighting sections, printing copies. The evidence wasn't just for me anymore, it was for everyone Mark had silenced. But revenge, I realized, didn't have to be loud. It just had to be permanent. I stood at the window, looking out at the fence line that had caused all this chaos. The same fence they'd crossed, the same boundary they pretended to own. "If they want access," I muttered, a slow, grim smile tugging at my lips, "I'll give them something to look at forever." And in that moment, I knew exactly what I was going to build. When Mark threatened to measure my fence line, I couldn't help but smirk. "Go ahead," I told him, voice steady as steel. I built it half an inch inside the law. That line had been my mantra for the past 2 weeks. Every swing of the hammer, every stroke of the paintbrush, every drop of sweat that hit the dirt beneath my boots. I wasn't just building a fence. I was building a message, one they'd never forget. It started the day I came home from the county office, the truth burning through my veins like fire. No easement, no access, no authority. They'd lied, and now I was going to carve that truth into the landscape. I tore down the old rotting fence plank by plank, the splinters biting into my palms, the air filled with the heavy scent of cedar and sawdust. The sound of my hammer echoed through the neighborhood, sharp, rhythmic, defiant. Some neighbors peeked out from behind their curtains, others stood on the sidewalk pretending to water their lawns. Word was spreading fast. Sarah Thompson was building something big. By the third day, the skeleton of it rose tall and unapologetic, a wall of heavy timber, built to the maximum height allowed by county code. But this wasn't just a fence. I designed it as an art piece, a statement of ownership and resistance. Metal panels, rust-streaked and strong, alternated with vertical wood planks that caught the sunlight like bronze. Across the center, I carved a single phrase in bold steel letters: private property, no trespass. Every strike of the chisel was a release. Every board nailed in place, a victory. My hands blistered, my back ached, but I'd never felt stronger. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming my space, my peace, my right to stand without fear. Neighbors began stopping by under the guise of curiosity. "It's big," one whispered, eyes wide. Another murmured, "You're brave, Sarah, but you know Mark's not gonna like this." I wiped the sweat from my forehead, glancing down the street where Mark's pristine white truck sat idling, his tinted window rolled halfway down. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. He was watching. By sunset, he finally got out. He walked toward me, every step deliberate, his jaw tight enough to crack a tooth. "You're violating multiple HOA aesthetic standards," he announced, loud enough for the whole block to hear. I leaned against the fence post, keeping my voice calm. "This structure is within my property line and meets city code. Texas fence law is pretty clear. Homeowners can build up to 8 feet high as long as it's on their own land." He sneered. "You think you know the law?" "I know it better than you," I said. That made his face darken. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Take it down before you make things worse for yourself." I smiled. "Mark, you've been walking through my yard for weeks. Maybe now you'll finally have to walk around it." He turned without another word, but his silence was louder than shouting. I watched him march back to his truck, his fists clenched, his shoulders stiff. The message had landed exactly where I wanted it to. That night, I stood in my backyard under the glow of my security lights, admiring the structure that now cast a long, proud shadow across the grass. For the first time in months, I felt safe, untouchable even. But peace in this neighborhood never lasted. The next morning, I opened my front door to find a single white envelope tucked beneath the doormat. No return address, no stamp, just a bold red scrawl across the front: HOA enforcement. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Formal letterhead, legal phrasing, all bark and no bite. "Cease and desist immediately. Unauthorized structure in violation of community harmony standards. Failure to comply will result in litigation." At the bottom, in thick red ink, one name was signed with dramatic flourish: Mark Daniels. I held the letter up to the sunlight, the ink bleeding crimson through the page. For the first time, I smiled, because now he'd made his biggest mistake yet. He'd put his name in writing. "Tear it down or we'll sue." Mark's voice cut across the street like a whip. He was standing on the curb, red-faced, fists balled at his sides as if he could will my fence to collapse just by yelling at it. I didn't flinch. I set my coffee mug on the porch rail, met his glare, and said calmly, "Do it. I'll see you in court." For a moment, he looked stunned, like no one had ever dared talk back to him before. Then he turned sharply and stormed off, his shoes slapping the pavement. I watched him go, my heart steady, my voice still echoing in my ears. I'd had enough of being scared. This time I was fighting back the right way, legally, methodically, and with someone who actually knew how to win. That's how I met Alex Carter, an attorney who'd built his entire career exposing crooked HOAs. His office smelled like paper, coffee, and confidence. He didn't waste time with small talk. I spread every document I had across his desk: letters, photos, county records, even the cease and desist signed by Mark in blood red ink. He skimmed each page in silence, tapping his pen against the desk. "You've been harassed," he said finally. "Repeated entry onto private property, false fines, intimidation. This isn't standard enforcement. It's abuse of power." I nodded, the relief in my chest mixed with vindication. "Can we stop them?" "Oh, we'll do more than stop them," he said, smirking slightly. "We're going to turn the tables." Within days, Alex filed formal requests for the HOA's financial statements and meeting minutes. Public records that every homeowner has a legal right to see. I'd learned enough by now to know that harassment by an HOA board member can qualify as civil harassment under Texas law, especially when it involves intimidation or retaliation. And Mark had done plenty of both. The pushback was immediate. The HOA delayed, stalled, and lost documents. But Alex was relentless. When the records finally came through, he called me to his office again. I'll never forget the look on his face when I walked in. He had several thick binders spread across his desk, each labeled with dates and account numbers. "They thought they were clever," he said, flipping open one of them. "But corruption always leaves fingerprints." "What are we looking at?" I asked. He pointed to a series of transactions listed under Community Maintenance Fund. At first it looked ordinary: landscaping, painting, irrigation repairs. But then I saw it. The same company name repeated dozens of times: Crescent Maintenance LLC. Alex leaned forward. "You know who owns this company?" I shook my head. He smiled grimly. "Mark Daniels's cousin. A shell business created 2 years ago, right after Mark became HOA president. Payments funneled monthly, totaling nearly $80,000. My stomach dropped. $80,000. From homeowner dues, our money, going straight into his family's pocket. "He's been using the HOA as his personal piggy bank," Alex continued. "Fake maintenance contracts, made-up inspections, all of it. That's why he's so desperate to control who stays and who leaves. He's hiding financial fraud." I sat back in the chair, gripping the edge of the table, my mind racing. The fear that had haunted me for months was gone, replaced by something cold and powerful: control. The predator had just become the prey. Alex gathered the documents into a single folder and looked up at me, his voice quieter now, dead serious. "Sarah," he said slowly, "this isn't just abuse." He tapped the folder twice for emphasis, eyes meeting mine. "This is fraud. We're going public," Alex said, sliding the folder of evidence across his desk. His voice was calm, but sharp enough to cut steel. "Let's burn his little kingdom down." The weight of his words sank in slowly. For months, Mark Daniels had ruled over our neighborhood like a petty dictator, hiding behind bylaws and intimidation. Now, with those financial records sitting in front of me, proof of embezzlement, fraud, and deceit, we finally had the weapon to end it. I nodded. "Let's do it." The next few days became a blur of preparation. My kitchen table turned into a war room. Files, receipts, screenshots, and photos covered every inch. I labeled folders: financial fraud, harassment, unauthorized access, false violations. Every sheet of paper carried a story, not just mine, but the stories of dozens of neighbors who'd been fined, threatened, or driven out by Mark's lies. One by one, people started showing up. At first, it was Mrs. Collins from 3 houses down, who whispered at my door that she'd been charged thousands for illegal porch modifications. Then came the Garcias, whose pool permit had mysteriously vanished from HOA records right after they refused to donate to Mark's landscaping fund. Each visit added another piece to the puzzle, another reason to fight. The fear that once blanketed our community was shifting into something electric: courage. We met late at night, Blinds drawn, voices hushed. Alex joined by video call, guiding us through how to organize everything without violating privacy laws. He was calm, methodical, and ruthless. This isn't just misconduct, he reminded us. HOA fraud is a crime. It's grounds for immediate board dissolution and criminal investigation. But you have to stay factual. No shouting, no rumors, just evidence. I followed his instructions to the letter. We built a presentation that would hit like a sledgehammer. Clear slides with dates, invoices, and a paper trail showing nearly $80,000 in fake maintenance fees, routed to Crescent Maintenance, LLC, Mark's cousin's shell company. By the time we finished, the evidence was airtight. The next step was exposure. Alex contacted a local journalist he'd worked with before, a woman named Rebecca Hayes from Channel 12 Investigations. She had a reputation for tearing apart crooked city officials and predatory landlords. When she saw the documents, her expression hardened. "This is corruption at a community level," she said, voice low. "People need to see this." She promised to keep our names confidential until the story was ready, but she also gave us a powerful piece of advice. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. Once this goes public, they can't hide anymore. So we planned the reveal. At the next town hall meeting, where Mark always loved to preen in front of the cameras and remind everyone how much order he brought to the neighborhood. Only this time, we'd bring the truth to his stage. Word began to spread, quietly but quickly. Neighbors whispered on sidewalks, exchanged knowing looks at the mailboxes. Even the board members seemed uneasy. Two of them avoided my gaze entirely when I passed by. The perfect facade of control that Mark had built was starting to crack, and he had no idea how deep that crack ran. The night before the meeting, I stood in my living room surrounded by stacks of evidence, my laptop glowing with the final draft of our presentation. The nerves hit me then, not fear, but the weight of what was coming. I wasn't just standing up for myself anymore. I was standing up for everyone he'd ever bullied. I glanced at my reflection in the window. Tired eyes, steady breath, and a heart that no longer trembled. "Tomorrow," I whispered, "it all ends." The next morning, a notice slid under every homeowner's door. It was from the HOA office, announcing the upcoming community town hall. The location, the clubhouse. The agenda, general updates and compliance discussions. I smiled. Mark thought it was just another meeting. He had no idea it was going to be his last. Under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights, I stepped to the microphone. My hands were steady. My voice was not shaking. Every eye in the crowded community hall was on me. Neighbors, reporters, police officers, even the few board members who had shown up trying to pretend nothing was wrong. And sitting in the front row, arms folded, jaw tight as granite, was Mark Daniels. I looked right at him. "Mark Daniels," I said, my voice cutting through the hum of whispered tension. "You're done." The room went still. The only sound was the low buzz of the overhead lights and the faint shuffle of someone's chair. I clicked the remote in my hand, and the first slide flashed onto the projector screen. An HOA invoice from Crescent Maintenance, LLC. "For years," I said, turning to the crowd, "our dues, your dues, have been funneled into a fake company, Crescent Maintenance. You've all seen the name on your statements, but what you didn't know is that this company doesn't exist. Not in any registry, not in any legitimate business database, because it's owned by this man's cousin." A murmur rippled through the room. Heads turned toward Mark. He didn't move. I flipped to the next slide. Bank transfers, checks with matching handwriting, and the HOA's own ledgers showing community repairs that never happened. "Nearly $80,000, I said. "Gone. Used to line the pockets of family and friends while Mark Daniels fined us for our gardens, our fences, and our paint colors." Someone in the crowd gasped. Another shouted, "Are you serious?" Mark finally rose to his feet. "This is slander," he barked, his voice echoing off the walls. "These are fabricated documents. None of this." I clicked again. The screen lit up with an image. Mark himself, standing behind my fence, clipboard in hand, the timestamp from my security camera glowing in the corner. The audience erupted in whispers. Fabricated? I said calmly. Because that's you, right? On my property? The same night you fined me for obstructing community access? Mark's mouth opened, but nothing came out. I pressed on. This isn't about landscaping or community rules. This is about control, about power. You've bullied homeowners for years, fined them, threatened them, scared them into silence, while you stole from them. Behind me, Alex stood at the edge of the room, silent but steady, watching every reaction. I could feel the reporters' cameras focusing in, capturing every second. The neighbors, the ones who used to avoid eye contact with me at the mailbox, were now nodding, whispering, rising from their seats. The next slide appeared, emails between Mark and his cousin, joking about another easy payout from the HOA account. The audience fell silent. One of the board members, a woman with trembling hands, finally spoke up. I didn't know, she whispered. Mark told us it was all approved. That's how corruption works, I said, my voice tightening. It hides in paperwork, it thrives in silence, and it counts on people being too scared to question it. For the first time, Mark's confidence cracked. He turned toward the exit, muttering something under his breath, but two uniformed officers stepped into his path. Their badges caught the light as one of them said quietly, Mark Daniels, you're under investigation for fraud and embezzlement. Please come with us. Gasps filled the room as the officers took his arms. Reporters rushed forward, cameras flashing. Mark turned his head just long enough to glare at me. That same smug look he'd worn the first day he trespassed on my yard. But this time, there was fear behind it. Smile for the cameras, Mark, I said quietly. You always liked being in charge. They led him out of the building, his voice echoing behind him. Half denial, half desperation. You'll regret this, Sarah. You'll all regret this. But no one followed him. No one defended him. For the first time, the entire neighborhood saw him for what he was. When the door shut, the room erupted in applause. Neighbors clapped, some shouted my name, others just stood in stunned silence. I felt the adrenaline surge through me, but beneath it was something deeper. Peace, the kind that comes from finally standing your ground and winning. That night, the story hit every local news station. HOA president arrested for fraud and harassment. Homeowners expose corruption. My phone buzzed non-stop with messages of support. Thank yous, even apologies from those who once doubted me. The HOA board disbanded within a week. The accounts were frozen, the bylaws rewritten, and the neighborhood finally started to feel like home again. But just when I thought it was over, 3 weeks later, I found an envelope in my mailbox. No return address, just my name written in all caps across the front. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper, blank, except for one handwritten line in the center. You might have won, Sarah, but this isn't over. And beneath it, in the faintest ink, a signature I knew all too well. Mark Daniels. 1 year later, I stood in my backyard, my hand running along the same wall they once tried to tear down. The wood had aged beautifully, the grain darkened by rain and sun, but the fence wasn't just timber anymore. It was covered in color, a mural of wings, hands, and words painted by neighbors, friends, and even strangers who'd heard my story. Across the center, bold black letters stretched from end to end. We own this ground. That wall had started as an act of defiance, born out of anger and fear. But standing there now, hearing children laughing in nearby yards and the hum of life returning to the neighborhood, I realized it had become something far greater. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about remembrance, a promise that no one here would ever be silenced again. After Mark Daniels' arrest, the county prosecutor confirmed what Alex and I already knew. It was one of the worst cases of HOA fraud in the state's history. Nearly $120,000 had been funneled into personal accounts under fake maintenance invoices. The story made statewide news, and for weeks reporters drove down our little street trying to film the famous fence woman. I hated the attention at first. I hadn't done it for fame. But I couldn't deny what came next. The community changed. Fear turned into conversation. Homeowners started attending meetings again, asking questions, demanding transparency. New elections were held, with a brand new board formed, one that actually believed in serving, not ruling. Even the timid ones, the people who used to look away when Mark barked orders, now stood proudly on their own lawns, unafraid. And the best part? We opened the records. Every homeowner could see exactly where their money went, every transaction, every vote. Sunlight had done what threats never could. It disinfected the rot. That's when the mural idea began. It started with Mr. Wilson, the neighbor who'd warned me early on. He said, "That wall of yours, it used to divide. Maybe now it can unite." A local art teacher took the lead, sketching outlines with her students. Within weeks, the gray boards were alive with color, blues, greens, golds, each brushstroke telling a story. One section showed a gavel breaking a chain. Another, a woman standing between two tall fences, holding a document high under a rising sun. I didn't stop them. I just watched, heart full, as the symbol of my fight became the symbol of our freedom. Every now and then, new homeowners stop by and ask about it. I tell them the same thing. That's what happens when you let fear run your neighborhood. But it's also what happens when you decide enough is enough. If there's one thing this entire ordeal taught me, it's this: always document, always record, and never take anyone's word as law until you've seen the paperwork yourself. Every letter, every visit, every demand, record it. Truth wins in daylight. Lies only thrive in silence. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops that evening, the mural glowed in the last golden light. And for the first time since I moved here, I felt completely safe. The breeze carried laughter and the faint smell of barbecue down the street. This was home again, not because the HOA was gone, but because we had taken it back. I turned toward the camera crew filming one last follow-up interview and smiled. "Would you have built that wall?" I asked. Half to them, half to whoever might be watching later. Comment below if you'd fight back. Then I walked to the end of the fence and touched the final painted word: freedom. But as I turned toward my house, a shiver traced my spine. A new flyer had been slipped under my door that morning. Bold letters announcing another HOA scandal brewing in a nearby county. I smiled faintly. "Next up," I murmured, "the HOA that tried to evict a veteran for flying his flag." Because some fights, it turns out, are just getting started.